I have been a field medic for 31 years. I have worked triage lines after artillery strikes, set up aid stations in buildings with half their roofs missing, dressed wounds by the light of a headlamp with one hand while holding a compress with the other. I know what damage looks like. I know what dying looks like. I know the difference between the two, and I know from long experience that the difference can be smaller than most people would like to believe. I tell you this because when I found him, I want you to understand that I was not afraid, and I was not swept up in any particular feeling of warmth or heroism or mission. I was doing my job the same way I had done my job for 3 decades. That is the whole of what happened as far as I was concerned. On the morning I found the dragon they called Veth Kareth lying in the mud at the edge of my forward aid station. I did not know his name then. I did not know anything about him except that he was badly hurt, that he was still breathing, and that my kit was 6 steps away. Everything else, the titles, the ceremony, the war captain's words, all of that came later. The thing that mattered was those first 6 steps. I need to back up a little, though, because without context none of this will make any sense. There is a version of this story that people prefer to tell, which begins with the phrase, "she wasn't afraid," and implies something heroic about that. I want to dismantle that version before it takes root, because it misrepresents both me and what happened. Not being afraid is not a virtue if you simply haven't done the calculation correctly. I had done the calculation. I had run the numbers on what he was capable of at the moment I found him, which was very little, because he had been bleeding internally for the better part of a day and could not lift his head above the level of his own shoulder, and I had determined that the threat level was not sufficient to constitute a meaningful deterrent to treatment. That is not courage. That is arithmetic. Courage would have been treating him when he could have actually done something about it. And I want to be precise about the distinction because the version of this story that I find most accurate is the one where Petra Whale did a reasonable thing in reasonable circumstances, and the unreasonable part came later, from outside, from people and forces that I had not anticipated and could not have predicted. My name is Petra Whale. I was 58 years old at the time of these events, which means I have now had 2 additional years to think about them, and my conclusions haven't changed much. I was attached to a forward surgical unit operating out of a converted processing facility on the eastern edge of the Kethsolara Valley, which is a long, fog-prone strip of land that smells in the mornings of something between pine resin and iron, and which had been, for the better part of 8 months, one of the most contested pieces of ground in a conflict I will decline to name in specific terms. Suffice to say there were 2 sides and I worked for one of them, though by the time the events I'm describing occurred, the front lines had shifted enough that our aid station was functioning in something of a gray zone, still nominally behind our own positions, but with the kind of ambiguity about exactly where our positions began and ended that makes military maps look like works of optimistic fiction. The Varath, that is what we called the Dragon clans on the other side, which is a rough transliteration of what they called themselves, had been pushing south along the valley for 3 weeks, not with the kind of full-bore assault that films like to show, all fire and thunder and dramatic last stands. It was slower than that, and in some ways worse. A steady pressure, a repositioning, a series of engagements that left both sides ragged and the ground between us littered with things nobody wanted to think about too hard. I had been processing casualties for 4 days running with almost no sleep, and my station had expanded twice in that period to accommodate the overflow. I had a team of 6 working with me. Dahlen, who was 24 and the best wound packer I had ever trained. Miri and Sech, 2 nurses who had been in the field longer than I had and knew their business cold. Old Roan, our anesthesiologist, who was 63 and complained about his back every morning and worked 18-hour shifts without a word about it. And 2 orderlies, Pham and Cassie, who were young enough that the whole thing still had a quality of unreality to it that I sometimes envied them. The facility we were using had originally been some kind of agricultural storage and sorting operation. Long, low buildings with corrugated roofing, wide door to accommodate the movement of goods, a deep concrete apron in front that had been repurposed for vehicle staging. The main building still smelled, faintly and persistently, of grain and oil and whatever industrial cleaner had been used on the floors before we arrived, and no amount of our own antiseptic and field medical smell had fully displaced it. There is something specific about the smell of a converted facility, the way the original life of the place asserts itself beneath the new purpose, that I have always found, oddly, comforting. It reminds you that the building existed before the war and will likely exist after it, which is the kind of perspective that is useful to maintain. Behind the main building, separated from it by about 40 meters of churned-up ground, there was a smaller structure, a kind of secondary storage shed, really, with a sloped roof and walls of the same pressed composite that made up the main complex. We used it for overflow, for supplies, and sometimes for patients who needed quiet and a lower degree of stimulation than the main floor could offer. The high east-facing window threw a particular blade of light across the floor in the mornings that moved slowly, like a sundial marking the hours, and I had gotten in the habit of checking the position of that light as a rough time reference when I didn't want to look at my watch. I checked the shed every morning on my way in, before the day properly started, because there had been 2 occasions in the previous month when injured soldiers had made their own way there in the night, seeking somewhere to lie down, and I preferred to know sooner rather than later when that had happened. It was on one of those morning checks, a little after first light, that I found him. He was on his side, which in retrospect was fortunate. A dragon of his size on his back with a chest wound of that depth would have aspirated and been dead by the time I reached him. On his side, he had managed to keep his airway clear, though it had taken something out of him to do it. He was wedged partly under the lower storage shelf that ran along the back wall, his tail curled against the concrete floor, his wings folded in the particular tight, instinctive way that any creature with wings seems to fold them when it is not in condition to use them. He filled about half the available floor space of that secondary shed. That was the first thing I really registered. Not his markings, not his coloring, not the unmistakable Vareth pattern of the scales along his left flank, just his size. He was not the largest dragon I had encountered in the valley, but he was not small, and he was very clearly in serious distress. His scales were a deep, weathered bronze green, ridged along the spine and shoulders in a way that spoke of considerable age. The ridges had the texture of old scar tissue overlaid on earlier scarring. This was not a young warrior or a recent conscript. Whatever rank meant among the Vareth, it was written in those old marks in a way that I, without any training in Vareth culture or physiology, could nonetheless read in the way you can read age and hard use in anything that has been through enough of both. His horns, 2 primary, curving back from the brow, and 4 smaller lateral ones that I later learned were a marker of the Ketsolara territorial clan, were chipped at the tips, which is apparently a common consequence of extended ground combat. His claws, which were long and dark and curled slightly inward on the hand he had pressed to the concrete, were in better condition than the rest of him, which told me he had not been injured in whatever had brought him here. He had not fought his way out of something. He had walked or dragged or crawled his way here from somewhere else, and the wound in his side, a deep puncture, roughly circular, from something heavy and fired from a significant range, had been doing its slow, patient work on him for what I estimated, based on the dried blood and the color of the bruising that had spread out from the site of entry, was somewhere between 14 and 18 hours. The bruising was extensive. On a human patient, that spread and that color would indicate internal involvement, and the Vareth physiological briefings we had received, while not comprehensive, had noted sufficient parallel to human circulatory vulnerability that I was not prepared to dismiss the signs. The area around the entry point was hot to the touch. I knew this because I touched it carefully, and he registered the contact but did not move. His temperature overall was higher than I would have expected, even accounting for Vareth base body temperature, which the briefings put considerably above human normal. That, combined with the wound's age and depth, told me the fever was already beginning. He was conscious, that surprised me. His eyes, which were amber gold with vertical pupils, and the distinctive clouded outer ring that I recognized from the field briefings as a marker of the elder Vareth. The ones who had been in the valley since before the conflict began were open, and they tracked me when I came through the door. I stopped in the doorway for about 3 seconds. I want to be honest about this. I did a rapid calculation. I registered what he was, registered the Vareth markings, registered that I was alone, registered that he was very large and technically an enemy combatant. All of that happened in approximately 3 seconds, and then I set it aside. Not because I am particularly courageous, but because the calculation was not complicated. He was injured. I was a medic. He was not in any condition to be a threat to anyone. He could barely lift his head. The 14 to 18 hours of blood loss had seen to that. I went back to the main building, collected my trauma kit, and returned. I did not tell anyone immediately, which I realize in retrospect I should qualify. My intention was to report him to my commanding officer, a major by the name of Reth Cullender, who was competent and fair-minded in most respects. But my first priority was to assess the wound, because the window in which that wound could be stabilized was closing, and the bureaucratic portion of the morning could happen after the medical portion had done what it needed to do. That is how I justified it to myself at the time. It remains, I think, a defensible position, though I acknowledge that others in my chain of command saw it differently. I set my kit on the concrete next to him. His eye followed me the whole time. It was, I noted, the eye of a creature that had been watching the door since he arrived. The quality of attention it held was not the vague, unfocused gaze of fever or delirium, but the specific, directed attention of someone who has been lying in an unfamiliar place for a long time and has spent that time processing everything about it. He had heard me come across the 40 meters of ground between the buildings. He had heard the door. He knew exactly where I was standing before I came through it. "I'm going to look at your side," I said, which was probably unnecessary since he almost certainly did not speak our language. But I have found over the years that speaking aloud while you work serves 2 purposes. It keeps your own thinking ordered, and it tells whoever you're working on that you are not trying to surprise them. The second thing matters even when the patient cannot understand the words. He made a sound low, somewhere in the chest, felt as much as heard. Not aggressive. I've heard the aggressive version during one particularly bad extraction under fire 2 years before this, and it is a very different thing. This was more in the category of acknowledgement. "I proceed," the sound said, or at least that was my interpretation at the time, and it has since been confirmed to be approximately correct. The wound was bad. I will not describe it in unnecessary clinical detail, but bad covers the territory. The entry point had begun to close on its own, which was a feature of Vareth physiology that our medical briefings had mentioned, and that I had seen once before. A kind of biological instinct toward sealing, which in ordinary circumstances would be a remarkable survival advantage, but which in the case of a puncture wound with internal involvement was working against him, because it was closing over damage that had not been addressed. I needed to reopen the closure site, clear it, treat the interior damage, and close it properly. With a human patient, that would require general anesthetic. With a Vareth elder in the field, with my kit and my 6-person team and no surgical suite, it was going to require a great deal of steady hands and the cooperation of the patient. I looked at him for a moment. "This is going to be uncomfortable," I said. "I need you to hold still." The amber eye regarded me, another low sound. He did not move. I called for Dahlan on the handheld. Dahlan's voice came back in about 10 seconds. "Whale." I need you at the secondary shed. Bring the extended trauma pack and the deep wound irrigation kit. A pause. How bad? Just bring it. Another pause. On my way. He did not ask me anything else. Dahlen was 24, but he had the instincts of someone older, and whatever he had heard in my voice told him that the questions could wait. He arrived 4 minutes later, stepped through the door, saw what was on the floor, and stood there for about 5 seconds. Right, he said. That was all he said. He set the pack on the concrete next to mine and started laying out the equipment. I have thought about that moment many times in the 2 years since. Dahlen was 24. He had been briefed on the Vareth the same as everyone else in the unit, not as monsters exactly, but certainly as the opposing force, with all the psychological shorthand that entails. He addressed the wounds of his own people who had been hurt by the Vareth's fire. He had, I knew from a conversation we'd had 3 weeks before this, a friend in the Southern Battalion who had lost 2 fingers in a Vareth engagement near the ridge. He had every rational reason to hesitate, to ask me to wait for authorization, to be complicated about the situation. Instead, he took one long look, said right, and set up his equipment. I am proud of him for that. It requires a kind of interior clarity that not everyone has, and you cannot teach it. You can only create conditions in which it can show itself. We worked for about 2 hours on the primary wound. He held still, which, given what we were doing, was a feat of will I would not have expected and cannot adequately describe. There were moments where his whole body tensed, the muscles across his shoulders would go rigid, his claws would press into the concrete, the sound in his chest would change register slightly, but he did not move, and he did not try to stop us. I was aware during these moments of how conscious the choice was. He could have stopped us. He was large enough and, even in his reduced state, strong enough to have made the decision impossible to ignore. He didn't because he had understood. I believe this now as I believed it then, without being able to fully explain how I knew it, that stopping us would mean dying, and he had decided he would rather endure the former to avoid the latter. The clarity of that decision, the dignity of it, was something I kept returning to in the hours and days afterward. At one point I felt his breath, which was warm and carried a faint mineral quality, move across the back of my hand, and I looked up and his eye was directly on mine, about 8 inches away, and for a moment we just looked at each other. He was in tremendous pain. I could see it clearly, and he was choosing not to do anything about it because he understood that the alternative was worse. 31 years of field medicine, and I have not often seen that kind of deliberate patience from human patients in the same circumstances. I have seen people endure extraordinary things when they had no choice. What he was demonstrating was something different. Endurance with full understanding. Endurance as a chosen act, which is rarer and harder and more admirable. Almost done, I said. He breathed out slowly. I called Miri in around the 90-minute mark to help with the closure, because there is a point in that kind of procedure where a third set of hands changes the margin from workable to comfortable, and she came without fuss, and did what she was asked without once making a comment about the situation. Old Roan appeared in the doorway at some point, looked in for a long moment, and went away again without speaking. He came back 20 minutes later with 2 cups of something hot, and set them on the corner of the storage shelf within my reach. The small gesture of it stayed with me. When we were done, I sat back on my heels and checked my work. Dahlen checked it after me, because that is what we do. You check everything twice when the margin for error is small. He looked up and nodded. Good, he said. The dragon lay quiet, his breathing measurably steadier than it had been when I walked through that door. He had not lost consciousness during the procedure, which would have made the whole thing easier, but which, on reflection, I think would have bothered me in ways that are difficult to articulate precisely. He had been present for all of it. He had made a choice to stay still and let it happen. That choice felt important to honor, in some small way, by not reducing him to a body you worked on while it was insensible. I cleaned my hands, looked at him, and said, "You'll do. Don't move around more than you have to." He held my gaze for a long moment. Then his eye lowered, very slowly, and something in the way he breathed shifted, not unconsciousness, but a kind of surrender to rest, the way a body will let go of the tension it has been holding when it finally believes the immediate danger has passed. I went and told Major Cullender. The conversation that followed was, "I will be charitable, not comfortable." Cullender is a man who understands procedure with the kind of passionate thoroughness that makes him excellent at logistics and difficult at anything that doesn't fit inside the procedure's boundaries. He listened to me, which I credit him for. He is the kind of commanding officer who listens before he speaks, which is not as common as it should be, and the listening is genuine. He was processing what I was telling him and not simply waiting for his turn to respond. When I finished, he was quiet for about 15 seconds, which for Cullender is a significant pause. Then he explained to me, with admirable restraint, that I had treated a Varath combatant without authorization, in the middle of an active conflict zone, without notifying my commanding officer, and that this created a series of problems, not the least of which was that we were now in possession of an injured Varath elder in a secondary storage shed, which was precisely the kind of development that could produce political and military complications of a scope that neither of us was equipped to handle at the forward unit level. I told him I understood that. He asked me what I proposed to do about it. I told him I proposed to make sure the patient was stable and comfortable, notify the relevant authorities up the chain, and wait for guidance. He looked at me for a long moment. He is not a bad man, Cullender. He is a man who has learned to operate inside structures because the structures have, by and large, served him, and what I had done had bent a structure in a direction it was not designed to flex. He understood my reasoning, I think. He simply didn't know in that moment what box to put it in. There were, I gathered from his expression, several boxes being considered in quick succession, none of which quite fit. "Don't let anyone go in there alone," he said finally, "and get me a full assessment report before noon." I said I would. I should tell you what happened in the 3 days that followed, because it matters to understanding what came after. He stabilized. The wound closed cleanly. The fever that had been threatening on the first afternoon resolved on the second morning, and by the end of the third day he was taking water, which we provided in the large drums we used for equipment decontamination, because scale was relevant to the exercise, and what I could only describe as a careful, evaluative interest in his surroundings. He watched the shed's door with patient attention. He watched me when I came in. He watched Dahlen, who was the only other person I allowed to accompany me for the check-ins, with a slightly different quality of attention, more analytical, I thought, less immediately trusting, though trusting is perhaps a complicated word to use in context. On the second day, he made a sound when I came through the door. It was distinct from the other sounds he had made, not the low acknowledgement of the first morning, not the suppressed pain sounds of the procedure, but something that had a different shape to it. Dahlen, who is young and therefore less guarded about his instincts than he probably should be, said quietly, "I think that's a greeting." "Don't anthropomorphize," I told him. "I'm not," he said. "I've heard Varath in the valley use that sound when they encounter one of their own after a separation. It's in the cultural briefing, Section 4. I looked at him. "I read the full briefing," he said, with the mildly defensive air of someone who has been caught being thorough. I had not read Section 4 of the cultural briefing in anything close to its entirety, which I was not going to admit to Dahlen. I read it that evening. He was right. The sound was a recognition sound, not precisely a greeting in the human sense, but something in the register of "I see you, and I know what you are doing, and I acknowledge it." The briefing noted that it was used between clan members in circumstances of stress or extended contact. It was also, the briefing noted with some care, used toward humans on a handful of recorded occasions, all of them involving what the briefing described as sustained non-hostile contact. I thought about that for a while. On the third day, I brought him food, which had required a logistical conversation with Roan that I would prefer not to reconstruct in detail, involving the question of what, precisely, a Varath elder in medical recovery could or would eat, and what we had available that might approximate it. Roan approached this problem with the same methodical rigor he brought to anesthesia dosing. He reviewed the section of the cultural briefing that addressed Varath dietary patterns, cross-referenced it with the supply manifest, calculated approximate mass ratios given the patient's visible size and weight, and produced a solution within 40 minutes that was, as he put it, nutritionally approximate and logistically achievable, which is about as good as field medicine gets. I carried the result to the secondary shed myself, partly because I was the primary clinician, and partly because I didn't want to send anyone else in with a large container of unfamiliar food and no particular briefing on what might happen next. He ate. Slowly and with the particular careful deliberation of an animal that has been ill and is not yet fully confident in its own system, but he ate, and when he was finished, he made the sound again. I sat on an upturned equipment crate across from him and looked at him for a while. "You walked a long way to get here," I said. He breathed slowly, his eye was on me. "I don't know if that was intentional," I continued. "If you were heading somewhere specific, or if you just went in a direction that happened to bring you here." I was talking to fill the air mostly. It is a habit I have. Patients, human patients, sometimes find it soothing when the person working on them keeps up a low-level stream of calm talk. It keeps the environment from feeling threatening. Roan has told me, on more than one occasion, that the habit is also useful because it externalizes my own thinking, and that I have a tendency to think better aloud than silently. I choose to regard this as a professional observation rather than a personality critique. "Either way," I said, "you made it, and you're going to be all right." He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he lowered his head, not all the way, not to the floor, but to a point roughly level with his shoulder, which brought his eye down and slightly inward, and he held it there for a few seconds before raising it again. I didn't know at the time that this was a significant gesture. I found out later. I found out a great many things later, and one of the peculiarities of having been present for events whose significance you didn't fully understand at the time is that the retrospective understanding doesn't change the texture of the original moments. They remain what they were, not what they turned out to mean. On the morning of the fourth day, things became complicated. A staff officer arrived from the regimental command, Captain Ways, young, precise, the kind of man who has internalized the rank structure so completely that he experiences deviations from it as a form of personal affront. He came with 2 soldiers and with orders, which he presented to Major Cullender, and which Cullender presented to me with the expression of a man delivering information he would personally prefer not to be delivering. The order was, in summary, the Varath combatant was to be prepared for transfer to a detention and evaluation facility 20 kilometers south of our position. The transfer was to occur within 48 hours. In the interim, access to the secondary shed was restricted to authorized personnel only, with a security presence posted at the door. I read the order. I asked Cullender if the 48-hour window accounted for the patient's current medical status. Cullender said that the order had been issued at regimental level based on the information in my report, which had described the patient as stabilizing. I said that stabilizing and stable were not the same condition, and that a transport of 20 kilometers over the current road condition between our position and the southern facility, in a vehicle not configured for a patient of this size, and with a wound at its current stage of closure, represented a genuine medical risk. Cullender said he understood that, and that he would note my professional assessment in the record. I said I would like to speak with the patient before any transfer preparations began. Captain Ways, who had been standing 3 paces back listening to this exchange, said that access had been restricted and that my medical visits would be scheduled through his office. I looked at him for a moment. "He is currently my patient," I said. "I will visit him when his medical condition requires it." Ways said that, in his view, a Varath combatant in enemy colors did not qualify as a patient in the standard medical sense. I said that, in my view, 31 years of field medicine qualified me to make that determination, and that a creature breathing, wounded, and in my care was a patient regardless of what colors he was wearing. There was a pause. Cullender was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who is calculating the precise cost of several different kinds of inaction simultaneously. Ways said he would take the matter up with the regimental surgeon. I said I thought that was a fine idea. The matter was, in fact, taken up with the regimental surgeon, a woman I had worked under briefly a decade before, and who had the unsentimental practicality of someone who had been doing the work a long time. Her ruling, conveyed to us the following morning, was that the transfer timeline would be extended by an additional 72 hours pending my written medical clearance, and that I retained clinical authority over the patient's care for the duration. Ways accepted this with the compressed politeness of a man banking a grievance for future reference. I accepted it with the relief of someone who had spent 12 hours not thinking about what I was going to do if the ruling had gone the other way. I went to the secondary shed that afternoon. The security detail outside the door, 2 young soldiers who looked at me with expressions that combined deference and curiosity in roughly equal measure, stood aside. I went in and closed the door behind me. He was more alert than he had been. He had moved carefully from his original position, still on his side but shifted so that his back was toward the wall and his face toward the door, which told me something about his instincts and also, practically, about the level of recovery he had achieved. His breathing had steadied into something approximating normal, as best I could judge from the briefing documentation and from the 2 previous days of observation. The wound site was clean and showed no secondary infection. I sat on the crate. I told him, more or less, what was happening, which I acknowledged even as I was doing it was probably not useful in any direct informational sense, but I told him anyway. I told him there were people in the structure above me who wanted to move him sooner than was medically appropriate. I told him I had bought him some additional time, but that the time was not unlimited. I told him that I did not know what the facility to the south was like or what his reception there would be, and that I was sorry for the limits of what I had been able to do. He listened to all of this with his eye steady on mine. When I stopped, he was quiet for a moment. Then he made the recognition sound. "I know," I said, though I didn't know what precisely I was agreeing to. It felt right. I went back twice more in the next 2 days. The wound continued its progress toward full closure, which was faster than I had expected. The briefing had noted accelerated healing capacity in Elder Varath, and this was the first time I had seen it in a clinical context rather than as a line in a document. Dahlen, on the second of those visits, conducted the assessment while I watched, and his observations matched mine. The patient was on a trajectory that would produce, if I was conservative in my written assessment, another 4 to 6 days before I could in good conscience authorize the transport. I was conservative in my written assessment. On the 5th evening after his arrival, a little after dark, something changed in the valley. I was in the main building finishing paperwork when Miri came and told me, with the quiet urgency she reserves for things that warrant it, that there were dragons outside. Not 1 or 2, which was not unusual near the eastern perimeter, but a significant number, and they were not moving in the way dragons move when they are on a tactical approach or a supply run, or any of the other purposes that had brought Varath into the proximity of our position over the previous 8 months. They were circling. Not the kind of circling that precedes an attack. I want to be very clear about this, because the distinction matters enormously. They were circling the way a flock of something large and careful circles when it has located a thing it is trying to understand. High, slow, deliberate. The ones at the lower altitude were angled not toward the main building, but toward the secondary shed. The security detail on the door had radioed for guidance and been told to stay in position and do nothing unless directly threatened. I put on my jacket and went outside. There were 11 of them that I could count, though the light was not good and I may have missed some at the outer edge of the pattern. They ranged in size from what I judged to be young adults to two that were clearly in the same category as my patient, elder, large, bearing the marks of considerable history on their scales. They were a mix of the deep bronze green I had come to associate with the territorial Kethsolara clans and a darker, more blue-shadowed coloring that I did not recognize from the briefings, which suggested they had come from somewhere beyond the immediate valley region. They did not descend. They held their pattern slow and high, and they watched. I stood in the open for about 2 minutes. Then I went to the secondary shed, told the security detail to stand clear of the building, and went inside. He was already awake. More than awake, he was fully alert in a way he had not been at any point since I found him, his head up, his eyes at their sharpest, his breathing rapid with something that was not pain. He had heard them or sensed them, or perceived them in whatever manner was available to him, and he knew what they were. He looked at me. I sat down on the crate. "Your people," I said. He made a sound I had not heard before. Not the recognition sound, not the pain suppression sound, not the acknowledgement sound. It was lower, and it moved through the concrete floor and up through the crate I was sitting on, and I felt it in my back teeth. I thought about what the cultural briefing had said about Elder Varath and communication. I thought about 31 years of reading patience in rooms where words were not available. "I'll open the door," I said. I went to the shed door and opened it wide. Cool evening air came in, carrying the particular valley smell of iron and pine, and from above came a sound that was in the same register as the sound he had just made, 11 voices, or something like voices, a harmonic of feeling rather than language, felt in the body before it was heard in the ears. The 2 security soldiers had backed up to a distance of perhaps 30 meters and were watching with the expressions of people who are doing a very good job of not running. I stood in the open doorway. I was not, in that moment, thinking about protocol or authorization or Captain Way's opinion of the proceedings. I was thinking about a creature on the concrete floor behind me who had held still through 2 hours of significant pain because he had understood that it was necessary, and who had been meeting my eye for 5 days with something I could only call a kind of stubborn, patient regard, and I was thinking that whatever was happening now was his business to conduct, not mine to prevent. I thought about the sound he had made when I told him there were people who wanted to move him sooner than was medically appropriate. I thought about the 9 days of careful, unhurried regard. I thought about the way Roan had brought 2 cups of something hot on the first morning without being asked, and set them in reach without comment, because that is what you do when someone is doing work that matters. You put something warm within reach and you go back to your own work, and the gesture says what there isn't time to say aloud. I thought about Dalen's right and Miri's wordless assistance, and the whole accumulated human weight of a team that had simply done what the situation asked without requiring the situation to be explained and justified, and filed in the appropriate administrative category first. None of this was particularly heroic. It was, I thought, standing there in the door with the cold valley air on my face, simply what people do when they are paying attention. One of the large ones descended. Not all the way to the ground, it held at a height of roughly 30 meters, which brought it to a position where it could look directly through the open door of the shed. It was larger than my patient, with the darker blue-shadowed scales, and its eyes, which I could see clearly even at that distance because they were remarkable, were a deep, luminous copper, the color of something very old. It looked at him, it looked at me. There was a long silence. The circling above had slowed and settled. Then it descended the rest of the way. I want to say, I held my position in the doorway with full composure. What actually happened is that I took one step back, which I think is forgivable given the circumstances, and then I held my position, which I think is the more relevant fact. The dragon that landed in front of me was the largest living creature I had ever stood within 20 meters of, and it landed with a precision that was remarkable, barely any ground disturbance, a controlled descent that spoke of extraordinary physical mastery. Its wingspan, folded now, was something I estimated later at roughly triple my patient's. The ridges along its spine were deep and layered, the kind of accumulation you see in old growth, in geology, in things that have been forming for a very long time. It regarded me with those copper eyes. The quality of attention was unlike anything I can readily describe, not threatening, not warm exactly, but thorough in a way that felt like being read, as if whatever it was looking for, it would find. Then it looked past me, into the shed, at the bronze-green elder on the concrete floor. The sound it made was very quiet, almost below the threshold of hearing. He answered. From behind me, lying on the floor of a converted storage shed, he answered, and the quality of the exchange, which I obviously could not follow linguistically, had a texture to it that I could only describe as relief. Not the relief of a crisis resolved, but the older, quieter relief of a thing that had been uncertain being made certain again. The copper-eyed dragon looked at me again. I said the only thing I could think of to say, which was, he needs another 5 or 6 days before I'd clear him for any significant movement. I was aware, as I said it, that I was advising a Vareth war captain, which is what I later learned she was, on her own soldiers' medical care, which is not a conversation you could have anticipated when you signed your enlistment papers. But I said it because it was the relevant information, and because, standing there in that doorway, with the cold valley air on my neck and the copper eyes on my face, it seemed like the only practical thing to offer. She regarded me for a long moment. Then she did something I have spent 2 years trying to find adequate language for. She lowered her head, not a bob, not a nod, not any of the perfunctory movements a body makes without intending significance. This was a slow, deliberate, complete lowering of the head, from the level of her eyes being at mine to the level of her chin being nearly at the ground, held there for a count of perhaps 5, and then raised again, and her eyes came back to mine, and they had in them something that I recognized, across all the differences between us, as acknowledgement. Not gratitude. It was deeper than gratitude and less emotional. It was the acknowledgement one person offers another when they have seen what the other person has done and are formally registering that it has been seen. The recognition of a fact. Then she said something, in their language, which I don't speak and had no means of interpreting in the moment. She said it directly to me, held my eyes while she said it, watched my face, and when she was done, she held the silence for a moment as if giving it room to settle. Then she rose, with that same impossible precision, and rejoined the pattern above. They circled for another hour, slow and deliberate, and then they were gone. The security detail radioed the incident up the chain at some point during all of this. I'm told the regimental command's communications center had what might charitably be described as an active 20 minutes, but by the time any authorization or instruction arrived, there was nothing to authorize or instruct. The valley was quiet. The secondary shed was quiet. My patient was lying on the concrete floor with his eyes half closed, and the particular quality of peace that comes after something has been resolved. I sat with him for a while, not doing anything, just sitting. After a time, he made the recognition sound, softer than usual, the version of it that, according to the cultural briefing, meant something in the register of "I remain here with you." "I know," I said, "get some rest." The next 6 days proceeded with a kind of surreal normality. The regimental command sent a formal inquiry regarding the incident, which Cullender handled with what I thought was admirable skill. He described it as a medical situation that had developed in a manner consistent with field protocols and concluded without incident, which was accurate if incomplete. Ways filed a separate report, which I was told about but not shown, and which, based on the subsequent communications I received, had apparently been read and assessed by the regimental surgeon, and found, on balance, to not constitute the formal censure he had presumably intended it to constitute. The regimental surgeon sent a brief message asking if I required additional support. I said I did not. The valley was quiet in those 6 days, in a way it had not been for the previous 3 weeks. I noted this, and so did the others. Miri commented on it twice, and Roan said something at the end of the 3rd quiet evening that I have thought about since. That the valley had the quality of a room after an argument, where the furniture has been rearranged and nothing is where it was and everyone is being very careful about where they put their hands. I thought that was precisely right. Something had shifted. What it had shifted into, none of us were in a position to know. Dahlen continued to assist with the morning assessments. He was methodical and exact and asked good clinical questions, which is all you can ask. On the 7th day he looked at the wound site and said, "That's remarkable," in the tone of someone encountering, for the first time, the full meaning of a word they thought they already knew. The closure was advancing faster than any of the briefing documentation had suggested as the projected rate, and the tissue quality around the site was better than I would have expected, even accounting for the briefing's notes on Elder Vareth healing. I noted it in the file without drawing any conclusions, because drawing conclusions from a sample of one is not good science, but I noted it. On the 9th day, I wrote my clearance, with specific movement and care instructions that I had no means of ensuring would be followed, but that I included anyway, because you do what the work asks of you regardless of what happens afterward. The morning he left, I came to the secondary shed early. He was sitting up, not fully upright, but no longer lying down, which was a meaningful change that his body had apparently decided upon in the night. His wings were slightly extended, not the tight emergency fold of the first day, but the cautious exploratory opening of a creature beginning to relearn what it can and can't do yet. I checked the wound site one final time, clean and closed. I noted my findings in the file I had been keeping, which was thorough in a way that was probably not strictly necessary, but that felt important to be. Then I stood up and looked at him. He looked back. The amber gold eyes, the clouded outer ring, the long and patient regard that I had come to know over these 9 days as a specific thing, not just the gaze of a creature looking at another creature, but the particular attention of someone who is paying close attention to something they consider worth the effort. He made the recognition sound. Then he made the other sound, the one from the evening of the circling, the low harmonic that moved through the floor and up through whatever solid thing you were standing on. He made it once, carefully, as if placing something in a specific location. Then he rose. It took him longer than it would have if he had been fully recovered. The process was deliberate, his weight distributed carefully, the wound site favored. But he rose and he stood, and he was very large in the concrete-floored shed that had been his recovery room for 9 days. And for a moment he just stood there, and I just stood there, and we looked at each other in the thin morning light that was coming through the single high window in the east wall. He lowered his head. The full lowering, the way the war captain had done it outside in the evening air, held it, the same 5 count, and raised it again. Then he turned carefully toward the door, and I went around him and opened it, because the door pushed outward and he was not, as yet, in any position to manage push doors without risking the wound site. I opened it, and the morning came in, the particular cold iron pine smell of the valley in early autumn, and the light, which was low and horizontal and a pale, clear gold. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out. Then he was gone. Not dramatically, no launching thunder, no fire, no gesture. Just the careful, measured movement of a creature that is still healing but that is, fundamentally, recovered, moving into a space that is its natural element, and the sky taking him back without ceremony. I stood in the open doorway for a while after. Cullender appeared at my elbow at some point. I don't know when he arrived. He stood beside me and looked at the empty sky. "I expect there'll be a formal inquiry," he said. "Probably," I said. We stood there a while longer. "Well," he said. "Sir?" "For the record," he paused, "in the report." "Yes." "I'd describe it," he said carefully, "as a full and appropriate application of field medical protocol in a complex and evolving situation." I looked at him. He was looking at the sky, his face entirely neutral, his tone entirely neutral. "Thank you, sir," I said. He nodded once and went back to the main building. I found out what the war captain had said 3 months later, when the conflict had moved into a different phase, and there were, for the first time, formal translators in the valley doing the slow, patient work of beginning to make one side legible to the other. I filed a request through the liaison office and received, about 2 weeks after that, a written reply. The translator's note prefaced it with a caution that direct transliteration of formal Varath speech produces something that feels, to a human reader, more ceremonial than conversational, and that this was not an affectation but a feature of the language itself, in which context and relationship are encoded in the grammatical structures in ways that don't carry directly across. With that noted, the translation read as follows. She had said a name first, not my name, which she would not have known, but a Varath name, in the manner used when a name is being given rather than spoken, meaning the name was for me, not a reference to me. The name was Veth Moraketh, which the translator broke down as 3 components. Veth, meaning the quality of an action taken without expectation of return. Mora, meaning the specific act of holding a thing steady when the pressure on it is to let it go. And Keth, which the translator described as the designation of a line, not a bloodline in the genetic sense, but a line of action, a continuity of doing a thing in the same essential manner across time, which in Varath naming practice confers a kind of extended identity. Veth Moraketh. The translator offered a loose English equivalent, she who kept faith without cause to. After the name, the war captain had said, "She is written," which the translator explained was a Varath formal phrase, indicating that a person's action has been recorded in the oral lineage of the clan. Not a list, not an archive in the human sense, but a living spoken record that is carried and recited by the elders and passed to the next generation and the generation after that. To be written in this sense is to have done a thing that the clan considers worth remembering, for as long as the clan continues to remember things. The translator added a personal note at the end of the letter. It said, "I have been translating Varath formal speech for 4 years, and I want you to know that 'she is written' is not a phrase they use easily or often. In 4 years I have encountered it in the record a handful of times. You should know what it means that she said it about a human." I folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, where it stayed for a long time. I went back to work that afternoon. There was a full patient load in the main building. There always was, and Dahlin needed a hand with a complicated wound assessment on a young soldier who had come in from the eastern perimeter with something that required careful management and clear thinking, and a steady pair of hands. The kind of work that asks you to be entirely in the present tense, which is, I have always found, one of the useful things about work. I provided all 3 to the best of my ability. The work doesn't change. Patients come and hurt and you address it, methodically and without drama, because drama is not useful in a medical context, and because the patient in front of you deserves your full attention and your full capacity, not your processing of their significance or your feelings about the situation or any of the other human things that will be there when the work is done, and the patient is stable, and the particular crisis of the present moment has been resolved. That is what I have always believed. That is what 31 years in the field has made of me, and I would not change it. But I will tell you this. Some evenings, when the valley light is doing its particular thing, when it comes in low and gold through the high window in the secondary shed, which I still check in the mornings out of habit, or sometimes for no reason at all, I think about amber gold eyes in the morning light, and the full deliberate lowering of a head that means something was seen, and the weight of a name in a language that does not separate the act from the identity of the person who chose to do it. And I think about 9 days, and what it is to hold a thing steady when the pressure on it is to let it go. And I go back to work,